Hello everyone, today we talk about famine's Frumentary crisis and inversion of the demographic trend between the 13th and 14th century. We have already addressed this topic many times. The contraction of the great high medieval civilization that fundamentally contracts and shrinks by since starting from the fundamentally the end of the 13th century, at least in a more traceable way, let's say, and after a great period of expansion, nevertheless, that somewhat continued, right? Also, probably with an inflation that, in fact, hadn't built up to a certain point very solid basis, and the first half of the 14th century, that is actually before the big crack of the Black Death. So this period that lasts essentially two, maybe even three generations, in which we can observe not just in Western Europe, as we will see today, but more generally in Eurasia, a generalized trend of stagnation but not open recession, right? That, in a certain sense, paved the road to the arrival of other systemic factors that destabilized the system further, making it fundamentally crumbled. Naturally, the Black Death is the worst occurrence as a well-defined epidemiological phenomenon, but it might have been actually more like one of the consequences, that actually one of the major causes of the crisis that in itself it apparently triggered, right? This came to destabilize further a system that was already worn out, that we can see clearly from many sources of the time, was undergoing moment of crisis in many ways. And there is a great deal of methodological problems when discussing about these topics, because universally we don't have a complete picture of the whole. Many macroscopical theaters, we could say, times and spaces are unknown, or at least they may even show an inverted trend relatively to the one we have outlined in here. But generally speaking, and I say this, if anything, because I studied this moment of my work exactly this very decades, like the last ones of the 13th and first half of the 14th century, right? And I objectively realize that, systematically speaking, there is what appears in many ways as culminating of the system, right? It is as if you have a lot of kinetic energy at the beginning, and this thing goes gradually, exhausted, for reasons that in fact are difficult to merely attribute even to major, let's say, unexpected environmental reasons, right? Today we are all Anglo-Saxons in this regard, and climate change has acquired, this preeminence talking about this major phases, also probably of human civilization, because there is no doubt, and it's pretty clear in many ways, that these trends were accompanied definitely by structural changes tied to the climate, right? Specifically colding of the climate. And this is kind of obvious. It brings to the crisis, and a warming of the climate, it brings to an expansion. It is kind of obvious if you consider how fragile and delicate these pre-industrial systems really were, right? How low was actually the crop rate at the time, how these were overall, aside from talking about Western Europe, definitely we see a very rich area for medieval standards, but that were still largely, however, barely above the level of survival rate for today's standard, right? And that could in fact be put in crisis in a much greater, with this slight but yet big changes, considering that naturally the whole system was tied to agricultural production, and effectively, if there is a cooling of the climate, that is not going to be good. That it's not just a matter of that, right? And this is important to stress all the time. First of all, it's not a linear, gradual, unequivocal transformation. For, as we've seen, for all places and areas, this depends on a lot of aspects, right? These centuries start being well documented, right? In European history, we start having quantitative data that is comparable with the ones of other regions and so on. So we have finally something concrete numbers to reason on. Whereas already for the 12th century, for example, we mostly rely on secondary, mostly unverifiable hints about growth. At least in that century, that's what the trend seemed to be. And also, we don't have to forget another perspective that, of course, these systems might have been were evenly growing or decreasing in many ways, contracting in many ways on this outline, fundamentally from the 10th to the 13th century. This is great growth. Then eventually there was just contraction by the end of the 13th and 14th century. We've seen the Middle Ages, ideally, very arbitrarily are triggered by the goldening of the late antique system, where in another, the contraction even there in many ways, in the same with same data that recurrent sources that, however, should always be taken, with cum grano salis. And the other aspect that is often not considered, though, is that when you consider these progressive moments of growth, right? These were indeed moments of expansion and development of civilization. This is especially true for Western Europe in many ways. What Western Europe displays, in my opinion, compared to the Byzantine Empire, to the Islamic world, a much higher qualitative growth, starting from essentially the 12th century, especially. But the thing could be traced even slightly before. This is a problem, literally, of documentation, right? Sometimes think about the so-called revolution of the year 1000 that, of course, today in history we don't address anymore in these terms. Well, that's the thing that had been observed, but because by the 11th century, for the 11th century, there are enough sources to trace, a widespread agricultural expansion that, however, shows all the hints of a process that had not started at the moment, and that therefore had surely started from before. In fact, we look mostly today at the 10th century, also in part, especially for Southern Europe, even before, usually the 18th century, the 8th century, and generally certain aspects of even of continuity with the previous world. This is complicated because mostly a matter of kind of historiographical attention, interpretations, fashions, rather than a generalized interest. There is a lot to write in these fields, but one aspect that, however, is to be always stressed is the instability of the systems the more they were growing. I'll explain myself better. I mean, the system overall naturally was expanding, and it showed dramatic characters of stability and capacity of recovery in Western Europe, because this crisis that starts with the 14th century, let's say, doesn't bring an end to medieval civilization. On the contrary, right? It brings it further to another dimension, to the Renaissance. It is a product of medieval civilization. This didn't go like the ancient world, that after all had a much lower potential than we often think, and that fundamentally, transformed in a much more apparently regressive way than we, than in fact the late medieval one, the late medieval period that is not considered as a moment of generalized crisis. Right? It was the big break due, however, to a systemic fault, right? To the idea that these systems were growing in largely in an uncontrolled way. That politically speaking, there were lots of forces that fundamentally weren't framed under a stable, centralized system that could direct them in a more in a far-looking sense, right? It was mostly a contingental growth, and I suspect that most of the reasons why this crisis was triggered, and it's a part of an aspect that I'm studying for a specific region of Europe today, among other things, was actually war, right? Among the other things, right? Yet politics, society, and war altogether show, aside from the environmental problems that surely might have existed, it's pretty evident from the chronicles that at least there is a in these very generations a problem of the weather had gone crazy. This was damaging production. There was something that, at least by memory of man, hadn't been seen. So we don't know, because the historiography of the previous centuries maybe didn't write the same way the Europeans started doing at this point. So who knows? Maybe the thing had happened before, but it's not documented. So we might be fooled in that sense. But the point I'm trying to make here is more specifically that human societies are capable of messing themselves up quite well without any climatic help, right? And this is the impression that I largely received. 12th, 13th century, moments of great growth, yes, but also moments of great systemic shortcomings of intensification of wars, intensification, spread of epidemics on a larger scale. So a system that definitely was structuring itself within these, the range of these same threats, right? And part of the reason why it didn't properly collapse to the ground is that evidently it had some antibodies to exist in that sense, but that it's somewhat difficult to attribute exclusively to the climate. But if you study objectively, and there is a sound historiographical problem in the process, because I personally never studied the sources about famines, harvests during these times, and I should, by the way, because I presume I would get a much better insight of what I'm talking about, even if I studied chiefly military history. But the impression is it would be interesting to see there how much, for example, other factors aside from the environmental one, in an epiphenomenal way, are brought to explain the whole system. I mean, how these studies concentrate, for example, just on the astonishingly difficult task of trying to reconstruct what agricultural production could be by the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, in spite of better sources that we have, but definitely we don't understand it pretty clearly. And adding to that, lots of other factors that we don't really know. It's just basically how I'm doing in reverse. I'm making a terrible effort to describe the thing from a military point of view, but I don't have the time, because the work is not about that, to expand into the details of this other, say, socioeconomical historiography, or I don't know, environmental historiography, and so on. So it's obvious that this has created somewhat islets, that some bubbles that historiographically do not talk to each other pretty much, and today we're trying to change that. But at the same time, we are aware of something we said often, that that there is an increase in specialization in every field, and this actually rose backwards compared to that direction, because you may be talking to one another but not fully understand each other, because the level of specialization is such that you narrow things so much down to time and space, to specific realities, that it's very difficult to describe the whole thing in our pattern. And after all, after a conference in which you may have that meeting, the thing is not going to accelerate dramatically in terms of dialogue and further exchange. And we will come back naturally on this comparison between the various subjects, because it's really a crucial point of how we read history in the first place. But talking more specifically about this outer field compared to mine, as most of the fields I discuss actually in Schwerpunkt, because nobody's expert about everything, of course. But there are interesting dynamics that, in general, we also study. Basically, when you start first exam of medieval history, you're exposed, you start having an idea of how this thing structurally manifests itself. Then maybe you don't know the causes once again, but still there is a shared historiographical consensus about a certain trend, right? For example, this decline is obviously observable even in the fields I study. That in general, the polities, the wars of which I study are ever shorter in resources, or however need to reshape their their system to cope with a crisis that is evident at many levels. There are entire sectors that go wasted, entire communities go depopulated. This is very important, right? So one aspect, first of all, is the momentum, like that the previous expansion of high medieval civilization had, right? That was characterized in many ways by the extension of the arable land, right? This thing went on, right? These generations are a moment, after all, expansion in that regard, right? There is more land that is put to work, that is increasingly, more specialized. But the problem starts being that the availability of cereals, right, starts ever more resulting inferior to the needs of the population. And this is manifested, among other things, from the fact that while in the previous centuries arable land had been expanded and worked further, also, for example, developing specialized cultivations. At this point, there is another trend that focuses mostly on quantity, not much on quality. That is essentially having this lot of cereals that reflects itself on a less varied diet, but that is needed for feeding, for example, all those populations that had gone living in the cities that gave them job, right? And naturally, the cities grow because the countryside grows, but not necessarily the individual people are, having a better quality of life. This is another problem that technically this general improvement of the system in previous centuries had passed through the loss in freedom and autonomy sometimes of the peasantry, right? This is not so, even absolute, so dichotomic. The same peasant communities sometimes had enriched themselves, had the opportunity even to develop into something more, right? But indeed, even this broader crisis, saying Black Death on the long run, would rather damage the countryside than the actual city that we will see in part, even though it was struck, for example, by Black Death for obvious reasons as a major, epidemic centers, a center of traffic, and so on, but had much more capabilities to recover over the countryside, and in fact, towards the late Middle Ages, fundamentally gets ever more subjugated by the cities or by the local lordships, and tend to, at the thresholds of the modern age, to be ever more detached politically, to count always less politically compared to the city, right? That starts also developing much far-ranging traffics, right? This is evident especially in the Atlantic cities, but not only those. And generally speaking, the city increases in importance during the Renaissance. And there is, in these years, a marked imbalance between the urban and rural population as well, right? This is important that the cities start maintaining actually a lot of people now that are living with a very low quality of life. All the salaried workers who probably are not citizens, they live in the poorer quarters or even outside of the city walls in the suburbs, right? For which the city at a certain point is even obliged to extend, to build new walls compared to the times of Rome or the previous ones. The city does expand, democratically speaking, but with this larger masses of people, they are fundamentally ever more depending on the city, and who fed them in a way, who gave them a job for. So the situation naturally reflects similar trends even in the countryside, right? For which these people had abandoned their native villages to go live in the city, where they evidently had after all, a better life than home. So this doesn't reflect actually a great wellness, a great well-being. There are, in face of these crises, actually increasing attitudes. Even masses of people are thrown out of the city. The poor, those agitators that need they want bread. They want essentially to improve their living condition in a way that doesn't find room in how the political and social hierarchy the city had developed, and they're thrown out. Right. Also because imagine objectively the also the cultural difference that existed in this regard. And there is a great imbalance in this sense. But also from a sheer demographical point of view, there is probably a lot of people living in the cities, right? And who's going to work, right, for feeding them, for maintaining them? This is obviously always the countryside, but sometimes this point, the countryside of the local district is not enough. Right, so there are also grain imports. This usually happens, obviously, in most developed areas that can pay because they're rich enough to pay for grain imports. This will also save them, actually, during the same Black Death and this major famines also that we will see that started striking Western Europe in the first half of the 14th century. It seems that many soils had exhausted their fertile capabilities, right? They traditionally they had been increasingly, as we have seen, especially in more recent times, dedicated to cereal growth, right, to cereal production, and they were only partially regenerated with their, let's say, productive capacity of the fallow land system and other improving practices. So also there is to consider that some of the later, it's been pointed out that the expansion of the system, probably under this point of view, had been exhausted, also in terms of arable land, right, of actual amount of, of land that could be profitably reclaimed, deforested, and inhabited so that the local population could produce enough. Right, and these the last lands that had been put to work were, generally speaking, the ones that from the previous centuries had remained out because they were the less productive in the first place. So also these soils probably exhausted even in a shorter run their productive capabilities. And this was already, as we've seen, a consequence of an extremization of desperation in many ways. As about the myth of progressivity we were talking about before, it doesn't seem that the majority of the agricultural expansion was much due to a problem of from a, let's say, okay, let's simply expand. Like, people were pushed by hunger to expand. Right, to find new places to start a new and better life, right, and population had increased. So in spite of even some very, after all, minor improvements in the crop rate that in fact do not seem to have dramatically increased between the 11th and the 14th century. I mean, some regions did better than had done before. In proportion, generally speaking, Northern Europe, so since the 10th to the 11th century, a greater growth than the rest of the continent, but still, with not such a dramatic amount of production. And there are many studies about this that are also, in fact, very difficult to make. But generally speaking, all this, even technologistic trail for the idea that, new tools allowed a higher crop rate, no. It's actually, this history evidence doesn't show this at all. Like, better tools existed if there was a richer society could afford them and produce things on a much maybe on a larger scale, but more or less the crop rate remained the same. Certain areas that did not even actually so much deal of improvement, and others even decrease in importance, and this is not even connected, generally speaking, with technological improvements in agricultural tools. So there's not much of a bright picture. People needed to survive, simply to be fed. And at this point, it seems that the system had reached an imbalance for which there was ever less resources for satisfying the communities. And this brought, in turn, to a lowering of the quality of life and to other political and social problems that derived from it, weakening, generally speaking, the resistance of the system. Then there is the climate thing. At the same time, it seems perhaps at least that, in a more unstable, colder and more rainy weather, especially in Northern Europe, might have brought, together with all these other factors, starting from the end of the 13th century, the multiplications of bad harvests and famine years, right? And if from 1302 to 1348 we count as well as 20 famines, for example, for Languedoc, right, in southern France, things did not go well in areas like central northern Italy, like in Tuscany or in Emilia, that were, by the way, lands rich in bread, right, that starting from the 1270s fundamentally onwards started a thick series of productive crises and famines that were quite serious, telling the truth. And consider that southern France and northern Italy are some of the richest countries in Western Europe. So they are the richest. As a matter of fact, that at least for Italy, then the same crisis can be observed in areas like Flanders, right, that start suffering of this, as we will see from even the 10th of the 14th century in a devastating way. And relatively to this phenomena, we remain a bit struck by the fact that they manifested for single regions, right? That is, circumscribed territories, one at a time, right? This is very fascinating because it definitely shows that climate here has relatively few to do with the thing. Yeah, sure. I mean, every region, has its own climate in a way, and but a generalized climate coldening should have brought basically worldwide of a sensible decrease, and this might have been actually the case, but eventually here we have peaks, right, in specific regions that cannot be imputed to kind of local climate. It was different from the region a few tens of kilometers away. And this definitely speaks for a system that now is alternatively, like, kind of shutting down from a side to another for causes that are mainly political, are mainly social. It could be wars, it could be economical failures of some kind, and this is observed naturally also and definitely in parallel to natural disasters, right? Floods, for example, start being common. Something were greatly devastating, and they seem to be increasing, especially towards the 30s, the 40s of the 14th century. And there are also, however, years and sometimes even longer periods in which the shortage of cereals start interesting definitely wider areas, right? Even in here, in a systematic way, at least the sources from which we realize this are sources that are very careful actually about international trade, right? We're very lucky to have especially this Italy-Flanders axis that is connected to also some of the other major productive centers, for example, agricultural resources, northern France, also wool production in England, and that also basically are connected from the Italian peninsula with intercontinental trade that since the 13th century, as you know, had literally opened, these merchants regularly traveling to China, thanks to the so-called Pax Mongolica that, in fact, by the 14th century crumbles because the greater Mongol Empire is split into all various powers that put their tolls on the various currents and so on. So the great Asian, the Silk Road, right, is fragmented once again, is closed once again. So it's very difficult to measure the impact of all of these factors singularly. We just notice that they go in parallel altogether. So this could be causes and consequences easily at the same time. And this is how we read this stuff, generally speaking, today. What's a cause and what's a consequence, right? It's not easy to determine. For example, great part of the Italian peninsula was troubled in the 70s, in the 13th century, as we have seen, but also in the years from 1328 through 1330, 1339, 1340, and 1346, 1347. And also in southern Italy, that was also a pretty florid cereal production area, was invested by this phenomenon. It was a less financially dynamic area in many ways, but still basically most of what Italy was fed by came from there, right? And it was even exported in other areas, for example, the Mediterranean, but also on a larger scale. And the world, for example, as enormous cities at the time, like Florence or other major, so they all derived also some of their, in fact, population feeding capabilities from these international grain imports. And grain price is also a pretty good indicator of the market swings, because the market ups and downs were fundamentally measured on the grain price. And sometimes you see these prices wildly changing. I even started at some point to calculate that, but it's also very complicated because, for example, we don't know exactly what the units of measurements were in volumes, so in liters. So there's an enormous debate about these technicalities, because literally one unknown unit of measurement can literally make entire systems widely changing phase, historically speaking, and we just have to accept. In fact, in history, most things are simply unknown. It's kind of even silly to try to pretend we can know with certainty. But it's the general impression, in fact, that really matters overall. In 1333, instead, was a year of hunger for almost all the Iberian Peninsula, right? And obviously, this major, regional shortcomings determined a series of difficulties for the same interregional exchange, right? Because communities in Europe already at the time were starting to depend on one another, and especially the elites were essentially living of the surplus that was shifted from one era to the other. So this caused major also political instability that at that point might have caused wars and might have worsened the situation. So we have no clarity of how much was randomly caused by by environmental factors, and how much instead was actively brought by, let's say, devastating the countrysides and so on. Because sometimes we see here enormous damage done to the countryside. Wars were regularly devastating the countryside, and devastating the countryside doesn't practically mean that you just take out the harvest of that year, but that you literally destroyed all the infrastructures that could allow also in the future to keep producing that amount of resources in the same way. And this is really an enormous problem. If I have to think, lots of people literally changing place where they could live, others simply dying, and this is a dramatic situation that naturally has enormous repercussions. And we made a video about this, and probably will make others, on the first, let's say, major famine that we can say was a bit generalized all over northwestern Europe. So even a wider scenario was the one of 1315, 1317, the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, that interested this broader area, and that hit specifically England on a longer run. It was a Frumentary crisis, right, that struck mostly the cities that were grain importers, right? And it was accompanied also by the spread of infectious diseases, and locally to true pandemics, true and proper pandemics, right? So in that case, the connection, for example, between this agricultural production shortcomings and the spread of epidemics is pretty evident, right? And as we were saying before, just think about just what the natural health condition of a person in the 14th century could be, and how way more exposed to diseases they were, how low their immunity responses were, and how poorly they were nourished in general, and how the thing had worsened also in these terms sometimes for the previous centuries. Even here we don't have a full certainty, but at least in certain environments like the cities where they were more struck, this is quite clear. Also in the countryside, but this is just to counter the kind of positivistic statement for which we are sure that, I don't know, an early medieval farmer or peasant ate better and therefore lived also better as in parallel than a 13th century peasant. Well, that's kind of a long shot, right? We don't really know. The fact that you can eat more proteins because you just breed pigs or stuff like that doesn't necessarily mean that you live in a better place where after all your life is so better, right? It's not that if you're freer as an individual, it's so easier for you to go out there in a field and starting working it and producing stuff, because actually the history of high medieval Europe shows us the very contrary. That is, that the major improvements in agricultural production passed, and in general production in absolute terms passed through and were possible thanks to feudalism, right? Feudalism was one of the most powerfully dynamic systems of production of the High Middle Ages. Forget barter, the closed economies. The High Medieval civilization was born thanks to feudalism. The cities, urbanism, communal civilization was coming on top of that, right? And taking reins on some occasions, or developing in parallel. But the situation was largely growing because of this greater rationalization and collective management that the nobility had, because free peasants usually didn't have that capacity at all, but not even the interest, right? Just to make an example, we were talking about before the crisis that struck some of the richest cities in Europe. In Flanders here, during the Great Famine, at the end of October 1316, the city of Ypres counted 2,600 dead, right? Think about what it meant for cities that, I don't know how many people Ypres counted. I think, it could be a few tens of thousands, or even less, and 2,600 dead, right? From the epidemics, right? Not from hunger, but, count that, famines where people died in the street. It's something you could find in the Western world, even in the 20th century, right? So that's something that should make you think about. Here we have, as a matter of fact, the proportion 26,000 people was the population of Ypres. So it's 1/10 of the population. Is 1/10 of the population wiped out by epidemics. Ypres was one of the largest cities in Flanders. Consider that. So think about how this also, reflected on the rest of the region in many ways, and as we've seen, major trade centers as well. And even if in Italy things were a bit different, because actually a few people died for the direct lack of food, right? Because the peninsula was much better placed into international trade they had more money, generally speaking, to simply buy stuff from the abroad, start importing stuff from overseas. But it's certain, even in here, that the living condition of the more disadvantaged social classes felt heavily from the succession of annihilatory crises and famines. Right, the poorest actually among the salaried, the outcasts, the simply people who didn't even have a job began to increasingly become depending on public and private assistance, which means, by the way, also that there is a kind of a privatization in the way these solutions are. The state doesn't quite exist as we know it, right? So it's these major guilds, corporations, noble families, they start tying ever larger amount of people, labor force, and even fighting forces sometimes, under their control, right? I give you bread, but you work for me. And these people were desperate. They were starving to death. Okay, let's do it. That was not the only way. This was the only way to survive, in fact, in the state of serious denourishment, resulting, however, also more than other people, this happened socially speaking, that the poor were naturally more exposed to the rich, to illness and contagion on average. And this is not just because of of food, of higher immunity response, but also because of properly of mobility, of just being a nobleman could simply abandon the city, right, and go living in its rural holdings, while the city was being ravaged by epidemics, right? The poor had to remain there if he even could hope to get something to eat. And it's in fact exactly the increase of the index of mortality that was registered in the first decades of the 14th century to be accompanied also by a decrease in the natality rate. Right? This is interesting. And it might have actually been, this is how historiography started to put this, rather the major cause of the demographic decline. Right? That even without the contribution of more devastating epidemiological phenomena struck the populations of the Italian both cities and countryside. Right? This is very interesting because speaking of Malthusian cycles, this is a thing, right? That there is all an historiography developed chiefly from better documented areas, chiefly from starting from the early modern age, that observes all these. For example, the age which people got married, tied to the grain price swings. It was a normal thing, really. If people were poor, generally speaking, they tended to get married later, and vice versa. So, as a matter of fact, these trends are all but completely clear. They're actually far from clear, still for an age like the 14th century, and we don't fully understand what the thing went on. And it's really much easier to explain this, the broader dynamic, realizing that it probably trying to distinguish what the cause of the consequence, or trying even to isolate a single factor, is not really a positive. It's not really going to help to understand the whole, right? It's probably reading about the whole, all the factors at once, that can give a proper, more objective, more tangible picture of the historical reality of the time, rather than trying to make it a positivistic statement of this caused that, right? Because it's pretty clear that many things were going downhill at the time overall, right? And the moral dimension of even of social changes is something that is rarely taken into consideration, right? It's the attention towards these topics mostly came from a structuralist historiography that wanted to calculate precisely numbers, data, making it a positive social science, but it didn't work quite well, and also it opened rather to the, to much more eloquent perspectives in terms of what is that these people thought about their own world. Right, how they represent reality? All these images of that, for example, that start appearing, that all this tension, this pathetic aspect, even in art, etc. They represented a changed moral state. It can be even in there. We don't have to be tricked, to be fooled. It might have been more like an elite thing, or something that had a political meaning hidden beyond, and so on. But it might as well be that actually there was something greater to that it was interpreting a greater sensitivity to the problem, and especially considering that we have the proofs that actually was not the elites but the poorer people that suffered from this reality. So it was also a way probably to tie the hierarchies to the destiny, to the control of the masses in this regard. And it's understandable, because these populations were asking expressly for being helped, right? And there are many other, let's say, the famines in the first half of the 14th century is a famous historiographical topic, and obviously we will meet it again if we continue this kind of minimalistic series but there are many other topics connected to that. There are also the other dramas that happen after the Black Death, right? Or others that we can, in generally speaking, talking about epidemic pressure, or these, signs that of the crisis, that even before the big break of the mid-14th century, which these fans basically are, and all the massive consequences, like the population of the agrarian economy, social tensions and revolts in the countryside, the urban revolts as well. So all the financial crisis of the major banks and trade businesses, right? So the mercantile enterprises. So there is a lot about this. We will cover it gradually, and for now we came just to talk about this aspect. That is very important, and that, generally speaking, shouldn't be tied just to this moment to the observation just for this moment in medieval history, because you have to reason, like, this delicacy of the system related to agricultural cycles was an enormous deal throughout all the world Middle Ages. Was way more important, probably, in some cases that are even worse. They are simply worse documented. We don't know much about, but thinking about how dramatic the situation was at by the 6th, by the 7th century, just compared to this one. And in here, we rather see, in fact, something that struck the rest of, the society as a whole, because evidently it wasn't just about the mere agricultural thing, but of all the consequences that this shortcomings brought to politics, to society, that were, at the end of the day, somewhat more important on the long run, right? And I'm just like, sometimes I repeat myself with these topics, because I know something slightly more. Certain specific examples from these realities, but I rarely find the dedicated text and topic to discuss them. But this thing is much less, let's say, aseptic, cold than it seems. It's deeply tied to the vivacity of that world, in spite of the crisis. And you could think of the same thing today, right? It's like the coronavirus. It's obviously going to change the world, And it's not much because of the pandemics itself, but it's because of all the consequences, right? Even indirect ones of that. Look at international politics. A lot of things have changed only because of the pandemic. They will keep changing, right? Nobody had foreseen those, and there is this kind of state of, pessimism and uncertainty, and that's what is going to in turn change a lot of other things. So we can't just read isolated facts, isolated dynamics by themselves. They all happen because they are intertwined to a much broader system. That the more complex it gets, the more unpredictable it gets, and that's what's scary about it, right? It's not a matter that there's no positive approach to these topics. We can't say, we can't be sure that, from 1 year from now, things will go in this way. We can't. We can make our best, the original scale, more or less up to 3-4 months. And just by probability, right? And talking about that for 1 year is senseless. So just think about the state of uncertainty, which we do believe. There are certain things that are kind of unlikely to happen, certain more likely to happen, but it's what is important at the end of the day, what will eventually happen, or what we guessed it was happening. That's exactly what even history brings to of things past, brings you to the reality of that. Also, what we can know about. It's not that something happens, then you can say, oh well, it's easy to understand. It's not easy at all. It's not easy at all. We have seen it everywhere. With these topics, we've seen it from Clausewitz. It's that once the things happen, they're not understandable easily, and sometimes they will never be fully understood. That's where history is helpful, because it's the sensitivity that you develop by criticizing it is what you need eventually to try to be more flexible for what will happen eventually. Right, because it gives you a broader range, broader horizons, and doesn't make you, closed to just those monofactual or dichotomic explanations that are renownedly useless in any scientific field, because they simply don't work. And it gets very subtle, right? And it's very difficult to even point this out with. I can say with examples to today's world, but it's obvious that it reflects on even on political analysis. Like, think about most people actually reason in simplistic terms, and it's not a matter of saying what's right, what's wrong, because if the system is explained just through between two patterns, chances are that the question doesn't even that they posed at that point in those terms doesn't even make sense at all. There are lots of things to take into consideration that render that dichotomy useless. But humans are, after all, structured to reason in simple terms instinctively, right? And that's why you should get educated to understand something more, not because they magically understand who knows what, but because they are exposed to the complexity of reality. Anyhow, let's stop it here. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.